Hey guys. Tonight we wander back into the mud-caked lanes and hay-scented breeze of medieval Europe, where your shoes are made of hope, your neighbors are professional gossips, and your entire social mobility depends on never, ever spilling soup on the wrong man's boots. You're a humble peasant, a small speck in a sprawling feudal machine. And tonight, you're about to learn the hard way what happens if you offend your local lord. You've just trudged into town after a long day herding sheep that don't respect your authority, only to overhear the Lord's steward announcing a new bread tax. You scoff, just audibly enough for someone important to hear. Big mistake. Big, possibly stocks-shaped mistake. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You live in a world held together by obligations, not options. And the most important obligation? Deference to your lord. He's not a king, but around here he may as well be. He owns the land. You rent your survival on it. You first meet him, well, not meet exactly, when you're called to deliver your seasonal tithe, a sack of slightly unripe turnips and a chicken with attitude problems. You don't hand it to him directly, of course. That would be absurd. No, you kneel at the edge of the manor courtyard, while his steward, a man whose beard looks like it stores breadcrumbs, counts every offering with all the joy of a sleepy tax auditor. Your lord watches from a window, sipping something suspiciously non-water-based. His hair is far too clean. His robes suggest he has never touched a sheep. You are a background prop in his play. But every play has drama. This feudal lord, like many of his time, operates on a delicate mix of paranoia and performance. His status rests not only on land and titles, but on the visible, unquestioned obedience of the people around him. You offend him, even by accident, and you don't just bruise his ego. You call into question the whole divine order that put him above you. Now you might be wondering, was every medieval noble a pompous feather hat with anger issues? Not quite. Some were genuinely benevolent, or at least too distracted by wars and tournaments to notice your missteps. Others were like simmering pots of vengeance stew, looking for any excuse to boil over. And because there's no centralized bureaucracy keeping tabs, each lord has his own rulebook. Some offenses that would get you a friendly warning in one village might earn you a one-way trip to the cold stone thinking room in another. Historians still argue whether this inconsistency came from personal temperament, local custom, or just sheer boredom. Back to you. You've always known your place. Your hut is modest, your chores unending, and your worldview shaped by sermons, storms, and whatever gossip the baker's wife decides is today's truth. You understand that the feudal lord isn't just a man. He's the earthly limb of the king, the distant relative of heaven's will. To oppose him, even accidentally, is to tangle with the great chain of being, from your rung at the very bottom. Still, sometimes, people slip. Maybe it's your cousin, who decided to impersonate the Lord's hound during the harvest feast. Maybe it's you, forgetting to bow low enough as his horse kicks mud onto your bread. Or maybe you just look a little too skeptical when the steward says the new ale tax will improve road safety. Whatever the case, the moment your offense is perceived, things begin to shift. The villagers step back. Conversations stop mid-sentence. You hear the wind whistling through the thatch with the sort of exaggerated suspense that would make a theater director weep. The steward narrows his eyes. Somewhere a goat bleats judgmentally. You've become visible, and not in the good way. Interestingly, not all lords respond to insults with punishment. Some relish the theater of mercy, making a big show of forgiving you while reminding everyone exactly what they're forgiving. It's like reality TV with fewer teeth and more hay. Others go the opposite route. They make examples. You might be summoned, Not with a scroll or a gentle knock, mind you. Likely by a guard who smells of onions and carries a stick carved from regret. You're brought to the manor or the village square, depending on how dramatic they're feeling, while everyone watches. Because this isn't just about you. This is a performance. Lords understood, perhaps more intuitively than we give them credit for, that power is 10% laws and 90% appearances. If they let one villager scoff, what's next? Jokes, suggestions, uprisings. So your fate hangs in the balance. Not entirely on justice, but on timing, witnesses, and mood. And fun fact, some records show that lords would keep offender logs, little ledgers full of names and infractions. These weren't official documents, just glorified grudge lists. A kind of medieval HR file, except the R stands for reprimand via catapult. You, poor sleeper, are now on such a list. But don't worry, or well do. This is only the beginning. So, you've made it onto the Lord's radar, and not in a good way. You're now what we might call socially flammable, and you're probably wondering, what exactly did I do wrong? Good question. Welcome to the confusing and occasionally absurd world of feudal offenses. See, feudal law isn't a tidy rulebook you can flip through while sipping elderberry tea. It's more of a patchwork quilt sewn by moody bishops, power-hungry lords, and the occasional vindictive monk. There's no helpful signage saying, "Don't sneeze in the Lord's general direction." You're expected to know. And worse, you're expected to guess. Some offenses are obvious, sure. You steal from the manor, torch a barn, or insult the lady of the house's very questionable lute playing. Okay, you're getting punished. But most infractions? They're small, subtle, and terrifyingly easy to commit. Let's take a look at the scale of offense. Imagine a line with mild social awkwardness at one end and open rebellion at the other. Offending a feudal lord could fall anywhere on that line. It all depends on context, witnesses, and how well the lord slept last night. So you roll your eyes during Mass? That could slide, unless the priest reports it, and the priest is the lord's third cousin. Then it's defiance. You forget to offer your seat at the harvest feast? Maybe you're tired, or maybe you just questioned your place in the great chain of being. Either way, enjoy the stocks. There's even documentation from parts of the 13th century France where peasants were fined for unkempt appearance during manor proceedings. You could get in trouble for your hair. Yes, your hair. Historians still argue whether this was about hygiene, visibility, or just the steward having a grudge against mullets. Then we've got the animal offenses. If your pig wanders into the Lord's garden, you might owe a fee. If it eats anything, you could owe 3 pigs. There's a famous case in England where a goose accidentally interrupted a hunting party, and the entire family was fined. The goose was never seen again. Likely eaten, or exiled. We'll never know. But offenses aren't just about what you do. They're about who you are. A well-respected craftsman might get away with a cheeky remark. A traveling minstrel, even more so. Humor is expected from the jester class. But you, dear listener, you're a field dweller with questionable shoes. You are not extended the luxury of irony. And here's a fun wrinkle. Lords are easily embarrassed, in front of guests especially. If your slip-up happens while they're entertaining other nobles, oh, now it's not just rudeness. Now it's a challenge to their honor. Which means you might find yourself being punished extra historically for dramatic effect. Punishments are often as unpredictable as the offense itself. Some lords liked public penance. Force the offender to kneel in the village square with a sign around their neck that says, "I spoke during the Lord's nap." Others preferred quiet retribution, a missing roof tile, an unexpected tax on your cider barrels, a sudden invitation to volunteer for boar hunting, with no weapon. The really tricky thing is that no one tells you when you've crossed the line. You just feel it. The steward frowns a little too long. The other peasants stop making eye contact. You hear whispers about making an example. You may not even remember the exact moment you went from peasant to problematic. That's the insidious thing about feudal power. It thrives on ambiguity. You never really know where the line is, so you stay well behind it. It's a system of control built on fear, guesswork, and the understanding that anyone could be next. Sometimes, the offense isn't even your fault. Your cousin said something rude at the tavern, and your family shares a roof. Guess what? Guilt by association is alive and well. One man's drunken insult becomes your entire household's moral failing. There's even a recorded case in Bohemia where a servant was punished, not for speaking to a lord directly, but for delivering a message from someone else who had. Historians debate whether this was standard protocol or just an unusually crabby noble. We may never know. And don't forget religion. Offend a priest, and that can quickly become a spiritual offense, and therefore a lord's problem. After all, if his peasants are irreverent, what does that say about his leadership? Better crack down, just to be safe. So, the offense scale continues to stretch and twist. What's safe today may be sacrilegious tomorrow. Even your tone matters. Did you say thank you with enough grovel? Did you bow with proper spine curvature? Did your voice squeak when you said "my lord," making it sound almost sarcastic? Your best defense is invisibility. Keep your head down. Avoid making sounds louder than a polite cough. Don't let your goose near the hedgerow. And if someone accuses you of a misstep, apologize like your life depends on it, because it might. But remember, even perfection isn't protection. A lord's perception is king. You could be the model subject, and one offhand comment, one misread glance, could send you tumbling down the ladder of favor faster than you can say, land lease revocation. Still, you've made it this far. You haven't been fined for your face yet. That's progress. And tomorrow? Tomorrow brings the potential for more misunderstanding, more micro errors, more medieval HR incidents, because the offense scale never sleeps. But for now, your only crime is existing in a feudal world, where sneezing too confidently might be mistaken for rebellion. Let's say it wasn't theft or high treason. Let's say your downfall was something smaller, something softer, like accidentally bumping into the Lord's niece during the harvest festival while carrying a very suspicious-looking jug of cider. Or perhaps you dared to whistle during evening prayers, and your melody sounded just a little too jaunty. Welcome to Peasant Faux Pas 101, the unsung curriculum of medieval survival. This is where your true education begins. Because in a world where lords wield power like a child with a magnifying glass on an anthill, it's the tiny missteps that get scorched first. So, what sort of missteps are we talking about? Well, there's posture. Yes, posture. Standing too straight, particularly in the presence of nobility, could be interpreted as arrogance. If your spine suggests you've known dignity in this lifetime, that's suspicious. Conversely, slouch too much, and you might be accused of disrespect, or worse, of plotting something. Historians still argue whether villagers actually trained their children to perfect the appropriate bow depth, but in some regions, there's evidence of communal bowing drills. Imagine that. 6-year-olds curtsying for their lives while someone's grandma shouts, "Lower Milla, or the Lord will think you hate his horses." And speaking of horses, never ever compliment the Lord's steed unless you're absolutely certain it's the right steed. There's a delightful little anecdote about a miller in Normandy who once called the Baron's aging mare sprightly. The Baron owned 2 horses. The complimented one had just broken wind mid-trot in front of dinner guests. The miller was fined a month's grain and forced to clean the stables with a spoon. Then there's church behavior. Church is where lords listen. They watch how their people pray. Are your hands folded too loosely? Do your eyes wander during the bishop's 4th sermon on obedience? Are you muttering Latin that sounds suspiciously like a complaint about tithe inflation? You may be thinking, Surely they can't tell what I'm thinking just from how I kneel. Ah, but that's where the steward comes in. The steward's job is half estate management, half neighborhood snitch. If you look vaguely unimpressed with divine hierarchy, it might get reported. The jokes are the real landmines. If you're ever tempted to make a sly remark about the Lord's thinning hair or suspicious mole, the one shaped like a small dragon, don't. Just don't. Medieval humor didn't come with safe spaces. A single whispered quip, something like, "His lordship's cloak looks like it wrestled a hay bale and lost," could become the cause of your entire social demise. There's even a recorded instance in 15th century Saxony of a peasant being punished for laughing too enthusiastically at a traveling juggler's mimicry of local nobility. His sentence? 30 hours in the town's listening chair, a special punishment seat shaped like an ear, where he was forced to hear prayers recited at him by angry monks. And then there's personal space. Now, modern listeners may find this hard to believe, but invading a lord's personal space didn't require touching him. Number merely walking parallel to his retinue on a path for more than 10 paces was considered deeply presumptuous in some territories. A blacksmith in Kent once got flogged for sharing road rhythm with the Earl of Sandwich. Even eye contact has its rules. Looking a noble directly in the eyes could imply confidence, or worse, equality. But not looking at him at all? That might suggest guilt. The ideal, historians say, was a fleeting, humble glance downward, just enough to acknowledge the presence without inviting smiting. And if you're thinking all this sounds exhausting, congratulations. You're beginning to understand feudal life. It's a system built on the anxiety of the ordinary. Lords didn't need to catch you doing anything truly terrible to punish you. They just needed to catch you existing wrong. Take the story of Agnes the spinster, a widow in Burgundy who was brought before the manor court for unwomanly laughter during a rainstorm. She had snorted when the steward slipped in mud. That's it. That's the whole crime. Her sentence? 6 days of spinning flax outdoors, in the same mud. Historians debate whether such cases were truly common or just rare examples that scribes found amusing enough to jot down. Either way, the threat of such punishment hung over villagers like the smell of overly boiled cabbage. There's also the matter of feasts and festivals. These were rare moments when the social curtain lifted just enough for everyone to mingle awkwardly under colorful banners and stale meat pies. But even here, the risk of faux pas multiplied. You could offend by dancing with the wrong partner, wearing colors that were too rich, or sitting too close to the salt bowl, which was often reserved for guests of higher status. Yes, salt placement was a social GPS. Sit above it, and you're presumed noble. Sit below it, and you'd better not reach for more than one pickle. At one particular midsummer celebration, a weaver's apprentice brought his own wooden cup to a feast and was accused of implying the Lord's goblets were unclean. He spent 2 days serving ale shirtless as penance. Not as romantic as it sounds. It was during a bee infestation. Still, not all lords were on the lookout for these infractions. Some genuinely ignored minor breaches, or let them slide in favor of maintaining goodwill. After all, happy peasants work harder. But even the kindest noble could be swayed by a well-timed rumor or the suggestion of disrespect. And the kicker? Most faux pas aren't punished directly. They're remembered, noted, stored like hay in the back of the barn, waiting for the moment when the Lord needs to flex his power or settle a debt of pride. Your harmless mistake becomes leverage, an excuse filed away until convenient. So every word you utter, every angle you bow, every joke you dare think, everything becomes part of your invisible social report card. You're not just surviving the weather, the taxes, the hunger. You're surviving manners. So, you've slipped. Maybe you laughed a beat too long at the jester's impression of the local knight. Maybe you bowed with a knee that cracked awkwardly and made someone think you were mocking the ceremony. Or perhaps you just stood in the wrong place at the wrong moment while the steward was having a particularly bad day. Either way, the damage is done. Now we talk consequences. First comes the silence. Not a dramatic, stormy silence, a practical one. People around you stop speaking when you enter the bakery. Someone shifts a bucket closer to the fire so you can't sit in your usual spot. The miller's wife gives you a glance that says, "Oh, you again." That's the village's version of a drum roll, the prelude. The world doesn't stop, but it slows just enough for you to feel it crawling along your spine. Then, usually, comes the steward. He never arrives at a good time. You'll be elbow deep in compost, or finally sitting down to enjoy a questionable onion pie. And then, there he is, with a folded scroll, or, more ominously, with nothing at all. Just your name and an expression that says you are officially on the Lord's schedule. You're summoned. 2 words. Cold as the slate floors of the manor house. No explanation, no tone. Just a summons, which could mean anything from "come explain yourself" to "hope you like rats." Now, the walk. It's a short walk usually, but in that short stretch between your hovel and the manor, or worse, the wooden platform in the town square, you imagine everything. Will they put you in the stocks? Will you be forced to apologize in front of a donkey? Will your goose be taken as collateral? This is where your mind becomes your greatest punishment. You start listing things you've done that might have been offensive. That time you coughed while the chaplain was sneezing. That time you cheered louder for your neighbor's harvest. That time you lent your shirt to a minstrel who mocked the Lord's fashion sense. It all comes back in a wave of sweaty paranoia. And then you arrive. If it's a minor offense, say you forgot to kneel during a noble procession, you might just be standing in front of a raised platform with the Lord seated above, clearly pretending to read a scroll while absolutely soaking in the awkwardness of your presence. He may not speak to you directly. He might mutter to the steward, or to his hunting dog, or to an empty goblet. This is all part of the power play. You aren't just being punished. You're being made to feel small, uncertain, like a squirrel awaiting judgment from a particularly vengeful owl. If your offense is larger, or if the Lord's pride is more fragile, you may find yourself before a manor court. Now don't picture a stately room with pillars and powdered wigs. No, this is a drafty hall with uneven benches, where the only parchment is already being reused from last year's barley report. The jury, if it exists, is made up of village elders who mostly want to go back to their porridge. The judge is either the Lord himself or his steward, both of whom likely formed an opinion before you arrived. Still, the process has its ritual. You're asked to confess, regardless of whether you believe you're guilty. If you protest too much, it's seen as impudence. If you agree too quickly, it's a trap. They'll assume you're hiding something worse. The sweet spot is somewhere between apologetic and tragic, ideally with a sniffle. Fun fact: in some regions, a good display of weeping could reduce your sentence. Historians still debate whether this was due to genuine sympathy or the theatrical enjoyment of watching peasants grovel. Either way, it's time to get emotional. Sometimes, the Lord asks for character witnesses. These are just other villagers who happen to be standing nearby. One might say you're generally respectful. Another might bring up that time you accidentally gave the priest salted butter during Lent. It's a roll of the dice, and the dice are covered in mud and suspicion. Then there's the dramatic pause. Always, always a pause before your sentence is announced. The Lord might lean back, stroke his beard, or feed a piece of meat to his dog, as though weighing the moral fabric of the universe. In truth, he likely made up his mind on the walk from breakfast. And then it happens. Your punishment is named. Maybe it's humiliation. Maybe it's a fine. Maybe it's worse. Whatever it is, the crowd murmurs, soft and sharp, like rustling leaves with opinions. There's no appeal, no quiet sidebar with a lawyer. Your fate is your fate, And your best bet is to look grateful for it. And sometimes, just sometimes, the punishment is suspended, held over your head like a chicken with trust issues. Let this be a warning, the Lord might say, pointing a jeweled finger at you as though you're a lesson. This is scarier than actual punishment. Now you're living under a cloud called next time. But what if there is no trial? That's the other version. You're summoned, and instead of a hearing, you're simply informed. You'll spend 2 days in the stocks, they say, as casually as if assigning firewood duty. Or, you're forbidden from the alehouse for a month. Or, your next bread loaf belongs to the manor kitchen. It's swift, brutal in its normalcy. One man in Wales was allegedly sentenced to walk backward through the village every morning for a week after mocking the steward's bald patch. No explanation, just reverse walking. He was known as Backwards Glyn for years afterward. Your own fate, still pending. But you now understand how it begins. With a look, a silence, a summons, and then a moment that will stretch out far longer in your mind than it ever did in real time. And the worst part? It's never clear whether this is the end of your trouble or just the beginning. Let's say things didn't go your way. The Lord's patience was as thin as his hairline, and your performance in court, though heartfelt and tear-speckled, was deemed insufficiently grovelly. You asked if you could just apologize and sweep out the manor stables. They responded by opening a trapdoor. Welcome to the dungeon. Now, before you imagine stone corridors and flaming torches a la fantasy novels, let's manage expectations. Most feudal prisons weren't grand, sprawling labyrinths. They were basements, damp, poorly ventilated, and filled with whatever the Lord's mason hadn't gotten around to draining yet. In many cases, it wasn't even a proper dungeon. Sometimes it was a root cellar that no longer stored roots. Sometimes it was an old well that happened to be empty and conveniently deep. There are records of prisoners being held in pig pens with the pigs, because the manor lacked proper holding cells. You're marched through a side door of the manor, past servants who avoid eye contact, into a chamber that smells like wet stone, regret, and something that might be mushrooms. It's dark. Not pitch black, but dim enough that you spend the first few hours trying to distinguish shadows from rodents. The floor? Dirt. Or if you're lucky, straw. Old straw. The kind that has seen things. Sometimes there's a wooden bench, bolted to the wall like it's trying to escape the smell. And yes, you're not alone. There's usually someone else in here. A tax dodger, a sheep thief, maybe a monk who got too handsy with the cheese rations. Conversation is limited. You exchange names, offenses, and bowel complaints. Then you fall into a rhythm of waiting, scratching, and contemplating whether your legs have always felt this damp. Contrary to what you might think, these punishments aren't designed to be permanent. Lords don't want you dead. Dead peasants can't pay taxes. What they want is compliance, obedience, and just the right amount of psychological discomfort to keep the village docile. So your stay might be short. A day. Maybe 2. Long enough for word to spread through town that you've gone below, which sounds mysterious but mostly means he's in the damp box. There's no toilet, of course. You're handed a bucket, or worse, not handed anything at all and simply told to be respectful of the corners. Historians still argue whether some of the more infamous noble dungeons even had drainage systems, or whether they were just self-composting. Food? If you're fortunate, you get thin stew. If you're less fortunate, a crust of bread and a disapproving glance. There's a legend of one lord who insisted all dungeon meals be slightly burned to reflect the seriousness of the offense. No one's sure if he meant metaphorically or just really hated cooking. Water, when provided, is ladled out of a wooden bucket that seems to come with bonus floaters. You sip cautiously, wondering whether it's meant for hydration or humility. And yes, punishment by dungeon wasn't always because of a trial. Sometimes it was preventative. The steward thought you looked plotty, Into the hole you go, just in case. This wasn't law so much as vibe-based justice. You might be surprised to learn that imprisonment wasn't the most common punishment. It was expensive. Feeding and housing even a single peasant for days meant spending resources. Many lords preferred punishments that involved humiliation or fines, more immediate returns on insult investment. But for certain offenses, particularly those tied to status, loyalty, or spiritual contempt, the dungeon had symbolic value. It showed the whole village that the Lord could put people beneath him literally and figuratively. And what about rats? Yes, they're here. Not in every cell, but in enough that the average medieval prisoner came out with a new respect for fast-moving shadows. Some lords even used this to their advantage, whispering that the rats in their dungeons were specially trained. This was nonsense, but effective nonsense. If you're very unlucky, you might find yourself in what's called an oubliette, from the French word oublier, to forget. These were vertical shafts, accessible only from above. You're lowered in by rope, or more likely, dropped, and left there. The only way out is if someone remembers you. Hence the name. They weren't always used to forget prisoners forever. But the psychological threat was enough to make people weep upon hearing the word. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, of a peasant who carved daily tally marks into the wall of an oubliette. When they pulled him out a week later, the marks were all in different sizes, growing shakier by the day, ending with the word sorry scratched over and over. The Lord had him released and gave him a job cleaning boots. The peasant never spoke above a whisper again. The dungeon wasn't just a punishment. It was a recalibration. You emerge from it changed, smelling vaguely of mold and humility. Eyes a little wider, bow a little deeper. You now know the sound of dripping water measured in minutes and the taste of stew that's 90% onion peels. And when you walk back into the village, people nod. Not disrespectfully, but knowingly. You've joined the unofficial club of those who have gone below. You might even earn some sympathy. The baker's assistant slips you an extra crust. The old man by the forge gives you a nod that says, "Been there." Even the steward gives you a faint smile, like a schoolmaster who's finally broken the wild child. But most importantly, you walk lighter. Not because your feet are sore, though they are, but because now you understand the boundary, the line. You know what can be said and what must stay a whisper. And deep down, you know. You never want to see that room again. So, you survived the dungeon. Congratulations, or condolences, depending on your perspective. You're sore, humbled, and profoundly aware of how much straw can itch when it's also serving as a mattress, insulation, and possibly the home of 3 fleas named Reginald. But your punishment isn't necessarily over, because now comes the show. If your offense was public, or if the Lord simply thinks your apology performance could use a few more spectators, then you, dear unfortunate villager, are about to become the main act in a quaint little production known as public humiliation. First up, the stocks. These wooden contraptions are not merely furniture for disgraced peasants. They're statements. Picture a sturdy wooden frame, roughly waist-high, with holes carved out for your head and hands. You're locked into it and left there in the village square, like a reluctant exhibit in the Museum of Avoidable Mistakes. Time varies. A few hours. A day. Occasionally overnight if the steward's feeling theatrical. You'll be surrounded by passers-by, neighbors, children, livestock, the occasional wandering dog, all of whom are encouraged, either formally or by sheer boredom, to participate in the festivities. Throw a turnip. Say something witty. Point and laugh. This isn't just punishment. It's entertainment. Some towns even had stock day schedules. Wednesdays were apparently the most common, sandwiched neatly between market and sermon. That way, you got maximum foot traffic, maximum shame. And oh, the signage. You may be forced to wear a board around your neck announcing your crime. These signs were rarely concise. Instead of "insulted the steward," it might read, "I said the Lord's hat looked like a dead weasel." Not only does this make your offense known, but it provides convenient reading material for passing children. Historians still argue whether these punishments had meaningful legal weight, or if they functioned more like local street theater. Either way, the effect was clear. Don't step out of line, or you might find yourself explaining your sarcasm to a goat. If the stocks are too basic for the Lord's taste, he might opt for the pillory. Now, to the untrained eye, the pillory looks quite similar to the stocks. But there's a key difference. It holds your head and arms upright, forcing you to remain standing. Not only does this increase discomfort, but it makes you easier to see, and therefore mock. It's the difference between a seated penalty and a full-on catwalk of disgrace. In some regions, pillory duty was assigned to repeat offenders, or those whose crimes were considered to challenge the social order. Sassid, the chaplain, pillory. Accused the tax collector of miscounting your hens, pillory. Claimed, out loud, that the manor cook uses salted butter in Lenten stew? Oh, that's at least pillory material. Now, for the more creative lords, and there were plenty, punishments took on unique and occasionally baffling forms. Take, for instance, the hat of shame. Worn by offenders during festivals, this was usually a cone or floppy contraption, adorned with bells, feathers, or sometimes vegetables. There's a record of a baker in Saxony being made to wear a cabbage bonnet for 3 days after shorting a noblewoman's rye loaf. Or the donkey procession. That's when you, the accused, are made to ride backwards on a donkey through the village, sometimes while holding a sign that says something like, "I thought I knew better." Bonus points if someone's ringing a bell ahead of you like a wandering herald of embarrassment. Why the donkey, you ask? Because in medieval iconography, the donkey symbolized stubbornness and foolishness. Also, it brays dramatically and smells terrible. Perfect accompaniments to your social collapse. And yes, the bells. Almost every humiliation ritual eventually involves bells. Hung from your clothes, carried by children, worn as earrings if your steward is particularly snippy. The idea is to turn you into a walking, jingling, cautionary tale. These public punishments served a dual purpose: correction and deterrent. You're not just paying for your offense, you're a billboard. A morality play without a script, only a scowl and a sunburn. Of course, there were limits, probably. Most villages were still guided by custom, religion, and a shared understanding of when punishment became abuse. Still, that line was blurry, especially if you were poor, foreign, or just chronically unlucky. And let's not forget the role of the town crier. He announces your offense with booming authority, often adding unnecessary flourish. Let it be known that Edgar of the Eastern Ditch did speak ill of the Lord's wine, followed by a theatrical pause as the crowd gasps like they're watching a scandal unfold at a very muddy opera. Your friends? They don't dare defend you. Your family? They might look sympathetic from a distance, but they know the rules. Intervene, and you're in the pillory next. So they lower their eyes and pretend not to see you balancing a turnip on your head while a pig sniffs your boots. And when it's over, there's no applause. No curtain call, just the creaking sound of the stalks releasing, a sharp ache in your back, and the slow, shuffling walk home with straw in your hair and humiliation lodged firmly in your spine. The villagers don't forget, not for a while anyway. You become that guy, the one who rode the donkey, the one who got egged by the priest's niece, the one who allegedly wept when the goose honked too loudly near the pillory. But eventually, someone else slips up, says the wrong thing, forgets to bow, has the wrong expression on Candlemas, and the stocks are reset. The town crier clears his throat, and for a while, you're off the hook. You'd think by now, the punishment menu would be complete. Dungeon? Check. Stocks? Double check. Donkey with bells? Honk if humiliated. But just when you thought things couldn't get more specific or absurd, we arrive at the delightful realm of weird penalties for petty crimes. This is where lords, stewards, and occasionally very creative chaplains really let their imaginations soar. You remember the chicken hat? Oh yes, that one's real. In parts of medieval Flanders, villagers who were caught stealing poultry, especially from noble coops, were sometimes made to wear what can only be described as a hat of poultry disgrace. Usually a bonnet or headband decorated with chicken feathers, some still attached to bits of bird, paired with a sign that read something like, "I cried foul." They'd wear it through market day, heads down, while actual chickens pecked around their feet like tiny, judgmental jurors. And that's one of the tamer ones. Other strange punishments were, well, let's just say niche. A man in the 14th century southern Germany who failed to return a borrowed wheelbarrow was sentenced to push an empty one back and forth across the village square for a day, while chanting, "I am not trustworthy with carts." The villagers reportedly joined in by offering fake items to transport, like cabbages carved from stone. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine legal trend or the result of particularly theatrical magistrates with a flair for flair. In coastal villages, punishment sometimes involved fish. Yes, fish. One documented case from Normandy tells of a fisherman who insulted the steward's poetry. His sentence? To carry a very large, very dead cod tied around his neck for 2 days. By the second day, the cod reportedly began to smell of both justice and regret. He was also banned from the village tavern until the cod was no longer among the living, which, let's be honest, happened within hours. Then we have the mock professions. These were punishments where the offender was forced to act out a twisted version of their original trade. A blacksmith who overcharged a noblewoman might be told to walk around with wooden tongs clipped to his sleeves, labeled hot-handed herald. A tailor accused of gossip might be made to stitch together rags in public with no thread, mending words instead of tunics, as one particularly smug steward put it. The entire point of these punishments was public memorability. A fine you could forget, a flogging faded. But being the man who wore a cabbage as a helmet for yelling at a duck, that stuck. In fact, sometimes the punishments weren't even decreed by the lord, but by the local manor court. Communal justice guided by custom and a kind of rustic creativity. These local courts, often composed of elder peasants and minor officials, would dream up punishments as a form of social management and entertainment. There's a recorded instance from Wales where a woman was sentenced to carry a ladder on her back for 2 days because she'd climbed into someone else's garden to borrow a melon. The ladder had a sign on it, "Not my garden, not my fruit." Legend says she became something of a celebrity and later sold melons herself. Capitalism, always lurking. But not all punishments were quite so whimsical. Sometimes they were just oddly specific. In 12th century Hungary, a man who refused to help during a fire was made to sleep outside in damp blankets for a week. So he'd learn the chill of ignoring others. It's poetic, petty, and extremely moist. And of course, we can't forget the echoing halls of ritual apologies. Some lords, instead of imposing fines or physical pain, demanded elaborate acts of contrition. These weren't apologies in the "sorry I bumped your sheep" sense. These were rehearsed performances. Picture this. You, standing barefoot in the manor courtyard, wearing your worst tunic turned inside out. You're holding a candle. You recite a 14-line confession about how your thoughts wandered during Vespers and how you will now devote yourself to studying the beauty of your Lord's handwriting. Yes, his handwriting. One nobleman in Burgundy made offenders copy his personal letters 50 times as punishment. Historians suspect he just really hated rewriting drafts himself. If your offense was against another peasant, but still reported to the Lord. Sometimes your punishment was simply to stand in public, holding the other person's hand for an hour. You were expected to apologize gently and repeatedly until onlookers declared the grudge resolved or got bored. Either way, awkward. But perhaps the strangest punishments were symbolic. A farmer accused of forgetting his place was once made to dig a hole, climb in, and then climb out while announcing, "Now I remember." He had to do this 10 times, while the steward rang a bell. One peasant boy asked if he was being born again. The steward was not amused. The beauty or horror of feudal society is that so much of its justice system was local, personal, and theatrical. Lords weren't constrained by rigid laws or standardized codes. They responded to insult with the tools of humiliation, performance, and occasional paltry accessories. And for villagers, the lesson was clear. Don't just behave. Behave interestingly little. Keep your head down, your voice level, and your satire internalized. Because if your mistake isn't painful, it might become public art. Now go wash the fish smell off your shirt and pray the steward's in a good mood tomorrow. Ah, the noble tradition of fines. If there's one thing that transcends all social classes, it's the universal sting of losing money, or whatever passed for it, when you didn't technically own anything. Welcome to the gentle art of feudal financial punishment, where you can't pay in cash, so you pay in sheep, bread, or deep personal humiliation. Let's say your crime was relatively minor. Maybe you didn't bow deeply enough. Maybe you muttered something about the Lord's hair resembling barn moss. Instead of a public spectacle, the steward, clearly tired and halfway through his turnip lunch, decides to hit you with a fine. That might sound like the best option, except you're broke. Remember, you're a medieval peasant. Your savings account is a dried sausage tied to the ceiling to keep it away from rats. Your assets are a pair of boots that double as dinnerware. You can't afford to pay a fine because money isn't really how you operate. You deal in turnips, favors, and the occasional half-rotten apple traded for gossip. But fines, oh, they come anyway. In most feudal societies, a fine is measured in value, not coins. That means it could be 3 hens, a sack of barley, or 2 weeks' worth of firewood. If you've got livestock, that's usually what they go for. Cows were the medieval gold standard, worth a small fortune. But if all you have is one lonely goat, guess who's going to live in the manor barn for a while? There's even a term for this: amercement. It sounds almost French, and that's because it is. It means a fine set at the discretion of the court, or the steward's mood. Not fixed, not fair, just felt appropriate at the time. Historians still debate whether amercements were meant to enforce law or simply function as side income for bored lords with expensive glove habits. So what happens if you can't pay? Well, the Lord doesn't want your excuses. He wants something of value, so you get creative. Option 1, in-kind payment. You give something from your home: a tool, a blanket, a year's worth of onions. Of course, you then have to live without it. Winter without that blanket? Cozy? Cooking without that pot? Hello, stick soup. Option 2, labor substitution. You work off your debt. This is how many lords got volunteers to fix walls, clean out latrines, or chase geese off the garden paths. You might be told to spend 5 days hauling rocks for the manor's new decorative wall, or you're loaned out to another noble for trench digging duty. In either case, the labor is harsh, the lunch is non-existent, and your name becomes synonymous with the guy who dropped that spade on Sir Elric's toe. Option 3, family contribution. If you can't pay, maybe someone else can. A sibling, a spouse, a wide-eyed child who offers their frog-catching services to the manor for 3 weeks. It's communal suffering at its finest. And if no one can cover the debt, then we arrive at the truly medieval solution: escalation. The steward might take items directly. A chicken disappears. Your only good tunic is missing from the clothesline. One time, a man's ladder was taken. and the village boys called him Low Reach Lothar for a year. In some cases, they take parts of your land usage, meaning you're now forbidden from using a certain pasture, stream, or even a well until the debt is paid. You're still living on the land, sure, but now you have to walk twice as far for water and share grazing space with Ulrich the goat whisperer, who smells like fermented oats and bad decisions. There's a recorded case from 13th century England where a woman was fined for disrespectful weaving. The fine? Her loom. That's right. They took her livelihood. Historians speculate she may have woven rude images, or perhaps the steward just didn't like the color mauve. Either way, she had to borrow a neighbor's loom for years, working at night, and was forever nicknamed Quiet Shuttle. And let's not forget the emotional toll. Being fined isn't just a hit to your resources. It's a mark. It's a story that spreads. Did you hear Wymond was fined for humming during Vespers? I heard Bertha had to give up her cheese mold because she giggled during the equinox speech. These tales ripple outward, become cautionary anecdotes, and make future visits to the alehouse significantly more awkward. Still, some lords did keep formal ledgers of fines, and in those rare moments of leniency, they'd cancel debts for especially piteous cases. One nobleman in Aragon reportedly waived a woman's fine after her cat was eaten by wolves during the night she was meant to deliver barley. His exact words? "She's paid in sorrow." A rare moment of empathy in an era ruled by barley quotas and fashionably armored pettiness. There was even a brief, localized tradition in certain parts of Italy where debtors could perform a song of penance to reduce fines. These songs were essentially improvised poems praising the Lord's wisdom, the weather, and any recently acquired horses. They rarely rhymed. They were terrible. But they were memorable. So what does it all mean? Fines weren't just about money. They were about control, visibility, and maintaining the delicate illusion that the Lord's authority had a price tag attached. You mess up, you pay up. Not always with silver, but always with something that hurts. And as you trudge home, lighter in goats and dignity, you remember the new rule burned into your brain. If you must offend the Lord, at least make sure you can afford it. Let's imagine for a moment that your Lord has decided he's tired of looking at you. Not in the go stand in the stocks kind of way, but in the please be somewhere else entirely kind of way. This isn't about a slap on the wrist or a turnip tax anymore. This is the grand, somewhat theatrical, but utterly terrifying sentence of banishment. Now, banishment sounds dramatic, and it is, but it was also surprisingly common in medieval justice systems, especially when the offense wasn't violent, but disruptive. Gossiping too loudly, stirring unrest, looking a bit too smug near the tax cart, or just being that sort of person who asks, "But why?" one too many times. So what does it mean to be banished? Well, it means you're not imprisoned. You're not fined. But you are, very officially, not welcome anymore. You're to leave the manor, the village, sometimes even the entire shire, and you're given a set amount of time to disappear. Your exact destination? Not the Lord's problem. You'd think there'd be some sort of process, a travel bag, a farewell document, maybe a map scribbled on sheep vellum. But no. More often than not, you're told, leave by sunrise or face worse. And that's that. No gold, no guide. Just your belongings, your legs, and your very questionable sense of direction. Where do people go? Some head to the next village over. Dangerous, because if you're caught too close, it's seen as defiance. Others follow trade routes, blend into merchant crowds, or aim for nearby forests and live like mildly unsuccessful outlaws. There's always the monastic route. You could seek shelter with a monastery. Some took in banished folk, particularly those who showed signs of penance, humility, and willingness to peel root vegetables for years on end. But beware, not all monks were friendly. And some monasteries were just as political and picky as the manor you just got booted from. You might also find refuge in a chartered town. These towns, often with their own markets and laws, were small bubbles of semi-freedom. If you could live there a full year and a day without getting arrested or summoned back to your original manor, you could sometimes claim a strange kind of independence. Historians still argue over how often this year-and-a-day rule was enforced or even understood by most peasants. But there are recorded cases of exiled folk managing to reinvent themselves as coopers, bakers, or amateur saints in faraway towns. A banished shepherd from Essex became a surprisingly popular fishmonger in York. Reinvention. It's not just for modern influencers, but for most, banishment meant poverty, fear, and starting from nothing. Your social ties? Gone? Your support system? Vanished. Your goat, sadly, is not allowed to come. In some cases, you're marked, visibly. A cut sleeve, a branded shoulder, a shaved head in a town known for bowl cuts. Anything that signals this one is not from here. You're not just exiled, you're labeled. Some lords even issued what were called tokens of departure, a small wooden badge or cloth scrap that proved you'd been banished. It didn't help you. It just made sure no one helped too much. One particular badge in 14th century France read, "He chose insolence." That's it. No name, just a warning. And if you return before your time, oh, now you're in real trouble. Returning before the period of exile is up, whether it's a week, a season, or indefinitely, was considered not just disobedient, but treasonous. The punishment? Almost always worse than the original sentence. Flogging, branding, or in some cases, full imprisonment, with no timeline for release. One particularly tragic case tells of a man in northern Italy who returned early because his wife was ill. The steward had him shackled and forced to sit outside the manor gates while his neighbors passed by. A sign above him read, "Too fond of home." He was eventually re-banished, this time farther south. And yes, some lords weaponized banishment. Instead of being a punishment, it became a power move. Exile someone loud, popular, or vaguely threatening. A miller with too many opinions. A blacksmith with too many friends. A midwife who knew a few too many herbal remedies. It wasn't always personal, but it always felt personal. And then there's the psychological toll. Leaving your land you've worked, sweated over, cursed during hailstorms, is devastating. It's not just relocation, it's an unmooring. Your identity in medieval society is tied to place, to soil, to routine. When you're banished, you don't just lose your home, you lose your narrative. The forest paths feel like judgment. The neighboring villages feel like interrogation. Every step echoes with the question, what did you do? And yet, some saw banishment as a strange sort of freedom. There are tales, half whispered, half sung, of banished folk who made good. A baker who started over in a port city and became rich. A scribe who wandered, wrote stories, and was never seen again. Even a former jester who joined a traveling troupe and made entire courts laugh with jokes about petty lords and itchy robes. There's power in exile, in being forced to begin again, in building something from nothing. But let's not romanticize it too much. Most banishments ended in hardship, wandering, hunger, cold. You spend your days watching the road behind you, hoping no one from your old life recognizes your gait or your haunted eyes. You sleep under trees, barter with strangers, and wonder if you'll ever feel settled again. And maybe you do, eventually. Maybe you build a new life, or maybe, just maybe, you return years later, quietly, just to see your old field in bloom, just to watch the village from a distance and remember the time you told a joke that was just a little too sharp, and then you vanish again. Like so many others before you, by now, you've probably figured out that feudal justice isn't a soft-spoken, reasonable negotiation over a cup of weak tea. It's more like a theatrical monologue involving sticks, which brings us to one of the most reliable and regrettable tools in a feudal lord's disciplinary toolkit, the beating. Ah yes, corporal punishment, the simplest, most direct form of lesson learning in medieval times. If you offend a lord, especially if you do so in a way that can't be fixed with fines, exile, or a week in the cabbage hat, you might find yourself sentenced to a formal, organized, and deeply uncomfortable round of authorized whacking. This isn't the angry tavern brawl type of beating. No. This is the legal kind, the ceremonial kind, the kind with rules, witnesses, and sometimes a snack break halfway through, depending on the steward's mood. You're summoned to the courtyard because punishment should always have good visibility, and told that you'll be corrected physically, which is the polite way of saying, someone is going to hit you while the village watches and takes mental notes. Let's talk instruments. The rod was the classic. A long, thin stick, usually willow or birch, that swished menacingly through the air before it ever touched skin. Flexible, light, but surprisingly painful. It was favored for its poetic versatility, hard enough to sting, but soft enough to be wielded dramatically by someone wearing too many rings. Then there's the staff, shorter, thicker, and used less often due to its ability to permanently relocate bones. More ceremonial, really. The threat of the staff was often more powerful than its application. For especially lowly offenders, the weapon of choice might simply be a knotted rope, something you'd usually use to tie a goat, now tasked with reminding you to bow more convincingly. And occasionally, for the real special moments, a lord might opt for the correction glove, a leather mitt worn by the steward or knight while they delivered a pre-planned series of smacks. Was it silly? Yes. Was it effective? Also yes. Interestingly, the number of blows was often symbolic. 3 strikes for insolence, 5 for lying, 7 for failure to deliver rent. Historians still argue whether these numbers had religious significance or were just based on how many the punisher could manage before tea. Your own sentence? Let's say 5 strikes. You're told to kneel. Sometimes you're tied to a post or held by guards. Occasionally, for lighter offenses, you're simply expected to stand very still and not flinch. Flinching, by the way, can add a strike. The first blow always feels worse than the rest, not because it hurts more, but because it comes with the realization, this is really happening. You're being hit in public as punishment, while chickens wander nearby and someone's child tries to sell bread to the gathered onlookers. The crowd watches, mostly in silence. A few wince. A few nod solemnly, as if to say, yes, that'll teach him to question the butter tax. Some might laugh, but only if they're very confident the Lord isn't watching. Now here's the kicker. In many cases, you're expected to thank your punisher. Yes, you heard that right. Once the beating is over, you bow or crawl, depending on how things went, and utter some variation of, I have learned, my lord. Thank you for your mercy. It's a moment that requires both humility and strong teeth clenching. To refuse this tradition is to risk further punishment for unrepentance. There's a recorded case from 15th century Bohemia where a young man said thank you too sarcastically. The steward immediately added 2 more strikes to improve his gratitude. No one ever accused medieval justice of lacking irony. Some lords preferred delegated beatings, meaning someone else gets to hit you. A steward, a guard, or in rare cases, a fellow villager. Imagine being thwacked by your neighbor Bernard, who once borrowed your rake and never returned it. The emotional complexity is staggering, and sometimes the punishment is deliberately gentle. A lord who wants to show mercy may instruct the steward to tap, not strike. This way, the ritual is fulfilled, the humiliation intact, but your ribs remain in one piece. It's like a medieval warning label slapped onto your body. Now let's take a brief detour into the ritualized beat and forgive method. In some regions, especially among Christian lords, with particularly theatrical chaplains, a beating would be followed by a symbolic forgiveness scene. After the strikes, the lord or his delegate would pronounce forgiveness, and you would be offered a sip of water and a crust of bread, symbolizing your return to the fold. It's strangely tender if you ignore the welts. Still, no matter the setup, the goal is always the same: control. A physical punishment doesn't just correct your behavior. It reminds everyone else what happens if they step out of line. That bruised back of yours becomes a parable, a walking caution sign with sore shoulders. But not every beating ends in fear. Some peasants, especially those who'd been through it before, found ways to reclaim a bit of dignity. Silent endurance. A well-timed joke afterward. Even a small nod to the crowd like, "Well, that was better than last time." These little rebellions mattered. They were social glue. Proof that even under the rod, humor could survive. Because feudal life wasn't just pain and obedience. It was performative survival. Learning when to bend, when to kneel, and when to stand back up and mutter something clever once the Lord was out of earshot. And as you limp home, sore and maybe a little lightheaded, you reflect not on the pain, but on the absurdity. You were beaten for a facial expression, a misplaced comment, a suspicion. And yet, here you are, still standing, still breathing, still making a mental list of which vegetables you'll never share with Bernard again. If you were lucky, you got the stalks. If you were unlucky, you got the stick. But if you were truly unfortunate, perhaps your offense was repeated, or particularly irksome to a steward with a flair for the dramatic. Then you found yourself staring down the cold, unblinking face of long-term imprisonment. Welcome to medieval prison life, or as it's more accurately known, damp, dark, and deeply not recommended. You may recall your brief trip to the dungeon earlier, but this is different. That was a timeout, a scare tactic. This question mark, this is full-on residence. You don't just get tossed into a pit and forgotten. Okay, well, sometimes you do. But in many manorial holdings, long-term prisoners were kept in repurposed cellars, undercrofts, or occasionally small towers that weren't quite defensible enough for battle, but were perfect for slowly making people regret their life choices. So what's it like? Let's begin with the floor, which is less a surface and more of a suggestion. Dirt or flagstone, covered with a haphazard scatter of old straw, rarely changed, often damp, and constantly trying to grow things no one wants to identify. If it's particularly wet outside, expect puddles. If it's hot, expect smells. Your cellmates? Oh, they're there. It might be just you, but that would be expensive. Most likely you're sharing a space with 1 to 3 other folks, all of whom are equally confused about what, exactly, they did to deserve being next to someone who snores like a moose caught in a bell tower. You exchange names, offenses, and maybe barter for that dry patch near the wall. And then there are the rats. Not just the friendly, curious kind you name out of loneliness, though those exist. No, we're talking about bold, emotionally complex rats. The kind that stare back. The kind that challenge you over crumbs and judge your sleeping posture. Historians still argue whether these rats were part of the punishment or simply roommates with strong opinions. Toilet situation? You'll love this. A bucket shared. Or if that's too generous, a corner designated by consensus. There's no privacy. There's no dignity. And if the guards forget to change the bucket for a few days, the entire space becomes a hot, echoing symphony of, "Why is my life like this?" The food. Technically edible, a crust of bread that could also be used to file wood, a broth that might be vegetable-based if you're lucky, water-based if you're not, and rat-themed if you're very unlucky. If someone on the outside likes you, they might slip you something better. But most of the time, the guard arrives, dumps something into your bowl, and leaves before you can ask if it's moving. And yes, the guard matters. Some guards are bored and apathetic. They ignore you entirely unless you're bleeding or on fire. Others take pleasure in taunting prisoners, rattling the bars, pretending to misplace the keys, or inventing stories about how your goat has eloped with the steward. And some just talk. Lonely, chatty folks who tell you all about their bunions while you sit there, spooning beet pulp and trying not to cry. Let's talk time. You have no idea what day it is. There are no clocks. The only measure of time is meals, guard visits, and how long your straw mattress takes to start growing moss. Some prisoners scratched marks on the wall. Some sang. Some just stopped trying. There's a famous example from 14th century Flanders. A man imprisoned for loud prayer reportedly sang the same hymn every morning for 30 days until the chaplain begged the Lord for clemency, just to stop the singing. And it worked. Occasionally, you get visitors. Family, if you're lucky. They bring bread, gossip, or whispered updates about who replaced you in the hay threshing rotation. Sometimes the village priest visits to remind you of your sins. He always seems to arrive right after mealtime, just as you're feeling mildly hopeful. And the worst part? There's no timeline. You don't know how long you're in for. A week? A season? Until the steward forgets why you're there? You're at the mercy of a man who once fined a child for climbing a tree with aggressive intent. Time becomes a strange soup, thick with boredom, fear, and the occasional rat scuffle. Still, there's community. You and your cellmates form an odd bond. You take turns telling stories. You invent games using pebbles. You teach each other songs from your home villages, all while scratching your names into the wall with the corner of a stolen spoon. There's even a sort of hierarchy. Who gets the corner? Who gets the dry spot? Who's best at calming the screaming guy 3 cells down? Sometimes there's a trial. Someone advocates on your behalf. Maybe a local noble intercedes, or a monk writes a particularly touching plea. But more often, your release just happens. A guard shows up one morning, opens the door, and grunts, "Out." No explanation, no ceremony. Just a shrug and a "don't do it again." And you walk, back to your village if it still welcomes you. Back to the field where someone else might be plowing your plot. Back to a community that now sees you not just as a neighbor, but as the one who spent time down there. The prison guy. The one who sang to rats. You're not necessarily shunned, but you're different now. A little slower, a little quieter, and a lot more cautious about your volume during prayer. But hey, on the bright side, you now know 17 uses for straw and can name at least 3 rats who probably still remember you fondly. So, you've emerged from prison. Your back still aches. Your dignity is missing a few pieces, and your name is now a punchline in 3 neighboring villages. You're ready to get on with your life. Plant some beans, rebuild your hut. Maybe not talk to any nobles ever again. Except, the Lord has other plans. Because, dear listener, there's one punishment that doesn't involve bruises, fines, or being fed mystery broth in a candlelit basement. No, this one is more elegant, more permanent. You're being reclassified. From this day forward, you're no longer a freeman or tenant farmer. You are now a serf. Yep. One ill-timed joke or mildly rebellious goat later, and you've earned yourself a lifetime of legal attachment to land you do not own. Your offense wasn't flashy. Maybe you mouthed off. Maybe you were late on taxes one too many times. Or maybe the Lord just found your presence slightly too confident. And now, your status has changed. Let's talk about what that means. Before, you had some agency. Not a lot, you were still a peasant. But technically, you had mobility. You could leave the manor if you wished, sell your labor elsewhere, join a guild if you were skilled, wander to a town, marry freely. Now, none of that. As a serf, you belong to the land, and the land belongs to the Lord. That makes you, in essence, a non-portable asset, like a plow, but with more complaints. Historians describe serfdom as a kind of soft slavery. You're not owned, but your time, labor, and legacy are. You can't leave without permission. You can't marry someone from another village unless the Lord says yes. And if you die, Your children inherit your status like a really disappointing family heirloom. This punishment wasn't always recorded in dramatic fashion. Sometimes it was a quiet line added to the manor's ledger. Roger of the East Ditch, now bound to land. Just like that. Your entire identity reduced to ink in a book held by a man who once fined someone for drunken fence-leaning. Some lords used serfdom as a social warning. Make an example of someone. He was just like you. Then he got mouthy. It wasn't always about economics. It was about control. Status. Proving that obedience wasn't just rewarded. It was the only option. Still, life as a serf wasn't hell, exactly. More like a long, muddy purgatory. You wake up, tend to land that's not yours, give a portion of your crops to the Lord, then watch as someone from the manor walks away with your best onions. You're required to perform corvée labor, forced, unpaid work, several times a year. Building roads, fixing fences, carrying heavy things up hills because someone rich wanted a view. Your rights? Limited. You can't take grievances directly to the king or outside judges. Your legal disputes are handled locally by the same system that turned you into a serf. You can't buy land, can't join the clergy without permission, and good luck getting your son apprenticed to anyone respectable. Son of a serf isn't exactly resume gold. There's even a debate among historians over whether serfs were allowed to own shoes. Not because the law banned it, but because their status made upgrades feel suspicious. Why does a serf need boots with real soles? Is he planning something? Of course, not all serfdom was equal. Some lords were lenient. They let their serfs keep a bit more grain, gave them festivals, even allowed small personal gardens. Others were less forgiving. One record from Bavaria mentions a lord who restricted serfs from owning knives longer than a carrot. Another in Castile banned singing during work hours, calling it distracting and possibly heretical. There were even hereditary serfs, entire families who'd been bound to land for generations. For them, it wasn't punishment. It was just life. But for you, this is a step down. A shift in the story you tell yourself about who you are. Because it's not just labor, it's the label. You go from being a person with unfortunate opinions to being part of the soil. The steward refers to you in passing. We've 3 new serfs this week. One's got a decent back for hauling wood. That's you. You're the back. But here's the twist. You can survive this. Maybe even thrive. Some serfs built decent lives. They married, raised families, became respected within their manors. A few even gained enough favor or saved enough coin to buy their freedom back. Yes, that's a thing. Manumission, it's called. A formal release. Usually expensive, always complicated, but possible. If you or your children serve loyally for enough years, the Lord might free you as a token of goodwill, or just to clear your name off the ledger. There's a famous story from Yorkshire. A serf named Martin, punished for stealing firewood, was reclassified after refusing to stop apologizing. For 10 years, every Sunday. Finally, the Lord reportedly sighed and muttered, "Fine, you're free. Just stop bowing already." And yet, most didn't get that lucky. Most remained bound, year after year, winter after winter, watching other people's barns fill with the fruit of their labor, knowing that a mistake, a slip of the tongue, or a moment of pride turned their life into a long, muddy contract with no clear expiration. But even within serfdom, there's power. Power in endurance, in small joys, harvest songs, stolen sips of cider, a child's first step in a field you tilled. You may be bound, but you are not broken. You still laugh. You still love. You still daydream about sock ownership. Because while lords may own your labor, your thoughts remain entirely yours. You'd think becoming a serf was as bad as it gets. After all, you're now a glorified field attachment, 1 step above a scarecrow and 2 below the steward's horse. But wait, feudalism always has another surprise tucked in its mud-caked sleeves. Because some punishments don't just strip your freedom, some turn you into a prop. And so we arrive at the remarkably undignified fate of being used as a knight's training dummy. You're probably wondering, surely that's an exaggeration. A metaphor? Oh no. Not in this wonderfully inventive world of status enforcement and martial showmanship. When lords and knights needed to train for battle, or more often, needed to perform the idea of training for a watching crowd, they sometimes required a realistic, mobile, and preferably terrified human target. Guess who drew the short straw? Now, this wasn't always a punishment. Sometimes it was a duty imposed on the lower classes. But if you had recently insulted the Lord's honor, or perhaps were caught sleeping through a manor sermon, congratulations. You're getting invited to the most painful version of a group activity since public dentistry. The setup: you're placed in the practice yard, typically a rough patch of ground littered with broken shields, discarded arrows, and the occasional unfortunate goose feather. You're handed a stick, or a shield, or if they're feeling very generous, a helmet that looks suspiciously like a pot with a hole poked in it. Across from you, a knight in training, typically a young noble eager to prove himself, wearing armor that squeaks with ambition. He charges. You try not to cry. Now let's clarify. You're not meant to win. That's not the point. You're there to move, dodge, yelp, and maybe help the knight practice precision hits, which usually means getting thwacked just hard enough to bruise, but not break. Ideally. Sometimes they call it simulated combat. Other times, just testing reflexes. You, meanwhile, are testing how well your ribs hold together under pressure. There are records from 12th century Normandy of peasants being used in mock charges, forced to run in a line so squires could practice horseback approaches. Occasionally, they were given padded armor. More often, they wore the same linen shirt they slept in, with a chalk X drawn over the chest. Aim here, the chalk says. Your organs politely disagree. And don't forget mounted drills. These were particularly humiliating. You're told to hold a shield and stand still while a knight on horseback gallops at you with a blunted lance. Supposedly, the blunted tip reduces injury risk. Supposedly. But historians still debate whether these were truly meant to test skill or simply to remind the village what happens when you speak too freely about the Lord's beard symmetry. One steward in Burgundy was known for forcing mouthy tenants to crawl on all fours, while knights practiced evasion tactics, a punishment and a show. Two peasants were reportedly nicknamed Sir Piglet and Lord Trotter for years afterward. Nobody remembered what they'd done, but everyone remembered the squealing. Sometimes there was audience participation. Your fellow villagers were invited to watch, which they did, nervously, because laughing might land them in the next round. Still, it was a spectacle. You dodging a wooden sword, you tripping over a rock, you yelling, "My ankle isn't a war crime," while a knight solemnly recited his training vows. Some lords added narration. They'd stand on a raised platform, explaining each move like a sports commentator. Note the angle of the strike. A good hit to the lower shoulder. That's what we want from our young warriors. Meanwhile, you're gasping on the ground, clutching a shoulder you weren't aware could dislocate. One infamous manor in the Low Countries held annual Defenders' Day, where all offenders from the past month were paraded out as combatants. They were given sticks and instructed to defend the honor of the manor by being hit with training staffs until they collapsed or said something noble. Most said, "Please stop," in increasingly polite tones. Of course, not every knight was cruel. Some apologized. One even offered a bandage after a particularly vigorous shield bash. "Sorry about the nose," he said cheerfully. "It's part of the process." And afterward, you're dismissed, not with fanfare or thanks, but with a vague gesture and maybe a grunt from the steward. You limp home. Your shirt is torn. Your ego is, well, wherever your missing boot landed. Villagers nod respectfully, not because they admire your martial prowess, but because you survived. That makes you a minor celebrity. That's the one who took a lance to the leg and only swore twice. And believe it or not, some offenders volunteered for training duty in lieu of prison or fines. Why? Because at least you got fresh air, and sometimes the night mist. Which, let's be honest, was better than listening to your neighbor recite 8 reasons you shouldn't have offended the Lord in the first place. Still, the lesson is learned. The next time the steward says, "You've been selected for training support," you run. You run like a goose fleeing soup, because the only thing worse than a medieval lecture is becoming the textbook. Let's say you finally escaped the worst of it. You've endured fines, shame hats, goat-based name-calling, and a close encounter with a knight's practice sword. You're bruised, but breathing. Humbled, but still clinging to a sense of self. You think, surely, this is the end of my punishment. But feudalism isn't done with you yet, because now comes the quiet, long-term, slow-simmer revenge of the lords. See, noblemen didn't always react to offenses with immediate fire and fury. Some played the long game. Why waste a good outburst when you can let your displeasure fester like a slow leak in a thatched roof? This, dear sleeper, is where things get personal. You wake one morning to find your goat. Yes, that goat, the one who likes turnip peels and your singing voice, has gone missing. No signs of struggle, no tracks, just vanished. You ask around. Your neighbors shrug, but you notice the steward walking by with a slightly smug expression and a faint smell of roasted meat trailing behind him. You suspect, but you can't prove, which is exactly the point. Feudal lords understood that punishment didn't always have to be loud. It could be strategic, subtle, and best of all, deniable. One week your rent goes up, mysteriously. The next, your plot gets reassigned to someone more deserving. Your access to the village well becomes restricted. Not officially, oh no, that would involve paperwork. Just inconveniently. Maybe the new hedge happens to grow right across your normal walking path. Maybe your storage shed collapses mysteriously after the manor boys accidentally practiced archery in its direction. The target? A painted turnip labeled with your nickname. You can't be sure, but it feels targeted. Historians refer to this phenomenon as non-formalized punitive action, which is academic code for grudges with infrastructure support. And it wasn't just lords. Stewards, reeves, even chaplains could get involved. There's a delightful record from southern England, where a priest allegedly adjusted the parish candle placement so that one particular offender always had wax dripping onto his pew. Was it deliberate? No one admitted anything, but the timing was remarkable. And then there are the festive exclusions. You turn up at the spring fair, ready to redeem yourself through vigorous maypole dancing, only to find your name has been removed from the contest list. When you ask why, the official shrugs and says, "Lost parchment." But somehow your rival, the smug turnip vendor with suspiciously nice boots, is on the list. Later that day, you win a vegetable carving contest. First prize, a round of ale from the Lord's own cask. Except you're informed that due to a recent social dispute, you're not eligible to consume noble beverages. The cask is passed to the runner-up, who carved a potato. Sometimes the revenge is emotional. A steward might start praising your neighbor loudly in public. Look at honest Harold. Always bows correctly, never questions the poultry tax. These compliments hang in the air like judgment. You're not even being punished directly. You're being contrasted. And the gossip, oh, it flows. I heard they had to use a whole bucket of salve after that beating. Didn't he cry when the knight just grazed him? Isn't he the one who once confused the Lord's hawk with a large chicken? You want to defend yourself. You want to clarify. But the more you protest, the more the rumors grow. Because in the medieval world, silence is strength, but chatter is content. Some of the worst revenge is bureaucratic. You're suddenly summoned for extra corvée labor, twice as often as before. You're informed that your land is under review for rebalancing, or that the tithe collector will now visit twice a week, just to make sure your barley is spiritually compliant. This isn't justice, it's administrative spite. And yet, you must smile, nod, endure. Because to challenge it is to offend again, and this time, they might not stop at your goat. They might start moving in on your firewood, your porch, your chickens. In a particularly spicy case from France, a villager who offended the baron's wife was assigned a new field at the very edge of the forest, right next to the swampy, frog-heavy bit. Every year during harvest, he had to shoo away what locals began calling the amphibian choir. It became a running joke. Oh, there goes Frog Henry. He never lived it down. And yes, revenge could follow your family. Your daughter, once betrothed to the baker's son, suddenly finds the match unsuitable. Your nephew doesn't get accepted into the scribe's apprentice program because of recent family discipline. It's all unspoken, unwritten, but clear. Because in the feudal system, your name carries weight, and once it's stained, it echoes like a church bell made of whispers. Some lords believed this kept order, that a lingering consequence was better than swift justice. Historians still argue whether this made for more stable societies, or just more paranoid peasants. But every so often, the cycle broke. A new lord arrived, the steward retired, a good harvest softened tempers, and slowly, your name recovered. People began to forget. You were no longer the one who insulted the lord's embroidery. You were just a guy with a rebuilt roof, a new goat, and a fresh start. Still, you remember. And you teach your children the lessons you learned. Never wear red to a feast unless everyone is wearing red. Never laugh when the goose honks during prayer. And above all, never assume that just because the punishment is over, the consequences are. Because in this world, revenge isn't served cold. It's served daily. In small, lukewarm portions. With turnips. You've tiptoed around the minefield of feudal manners. You've taken your beatings, worn your cabbage hat, and emerged from your stint as a human shield, with most of your bones still attached. You've paid fines in goats, served in shame, and seen your goose exiled for reasons you're still not clear on. You've been publicly mocked, privately sabotaged, and occasionally whacked with a ladle by a steward who claimed it was symbolic. And still, you might think, surely we've reached the worst of it. Ah, but no. Because by the late medieval period, the system itself starts to change. Not to become kinder, but pettier. Welcome to the age of offense inflation, where small slights somehow become grand misdeeds, and lords begin punishing with all the subtlety of a jester auditioning for drama school. Why did this happen? Historians still argue whether it was due to increased literacy among officials, more formalized manor bureaucracy, or just a growing sense of theatrical flair. But one thing is clear. As time rolled on, lords began responding to less with more. You didn't bow? That's not just rudeness anymore. It's spiritual rebellion. You muttered about taxes? That's not minor grumbling. It's a threat to the estate's moral foundation. You wore a slightly fancy belt to market? That's sumptuary violation. And we're going to need a public apology and an illustrated confession nailed to the barn. This is the era where punishment rituals ballooned. You don't just wear a shame hat now. You wear it while parading around the manor pond, holding a chicken, reciting the Lord's genealogy backward. A man in 15th century Saxony was reportedly punished for mocking tone during a blessing. His sentence, to copy by hand the entire book of Psalms using charcoal, on bark. It rained. But why the escalation? In part because lords were losing power. By the late Middle Ages, kings were centralizing control. Towns were growing. Merchant classes were rising. And lords, especially the middling ones, felt their grip slipping. So they doubled down. If they couldn't wield broad authority anymore, they'd make their local authority more ridiculous. The Lord might not control wars or national law, but he sure could ruin your afternoon with a surprise poetry punishment. There's a document from Flanders where a peasant was forced to compose 4 flattering verses about the steward's hat after describing it as sadly stovepipe-ish. The punishment lasted a week. The verses were awful. The hat remained unchanged. New punishments emerged, each more creative than the last. The apology dance, performed during feasts. The banner of shame, where the offender had to carry a flag describing their misdemeanor. Even the silence day, where a villager was forbidden to speak at all for 24 hours. If they were caught speaking, back to the stocks, with a turnip in their mouth for comedic effect, and the offenses became broader. Interrupting livestock auctions, using improper gestures while baking, complaining about weather in a way that questioned divine order. Even children weren't safe. One boy was punished for excessive whistling. His sentence, to act as the village's human bird scarer for a week, wearing feathers and shouting "caw" at regular intervals. The system had become a circus, but a dangerous one, where every clown had a scroll and the tightrope was made of tax law. And here's the kicker. Most people went along with it. Why? Because resistance was exhausting. Because punishment was public and cumulative. Because remembering how to behave was easier than constantly worrying whether you had. People adapted, developed strategies, whispered tip-offs, created folk rhymes like, "If the steward yawns thrice, don't fetch your hay. If the lady's bird sings, don't pass that way." Actual recorded rhyme. Historians believe it was less about birds and more about the steward's notoriously bad aim. But cracks began to show. Some villagers simply refused to engage. Silent protests, refusals to participate in public ceremonies, an increase in strategic muteness, where people just smiled and bowed, but said nothing. One manor in Brittany reported a communication drought, where no one spoke above a whisper for 6 days. The absurdity couldn't hold. By the early 16th century, larger legal systems began to formalize punishment and soften it. Lords were required to report offenses, use standard penalties, and avoid turning their courtyards into dinner theater. Many of the weirder customs faded, or in some cases became tradition. Yes. What began as punitive ceremony turned into festival ritual. The shame hat became part of carnival. The donkey procession? A lighthearted joke during harvest. The apology dances? Now optional, but still incredibly awkward. In time, villagers began to laugh at the very tools that once humiliated them. And lords, losing control, played along. Better to laugh with the peasants than be laughed at alone. So what started as pain ended as parody. The long game? It collapsed under its own weight. The feudal system, so rigid, so obsessed with control, couldn't survive its own love of punishment inflation. And you, survivor of offenses great and small, find yourself free again. Perhaps still poor, still wary, but no longer under the thumb of a man who believed eye contact was an act of rebellion. Because systems crumble. But jokes? Jokes survive. Even when whispered in the stocks, with a turnip in your mouth. Now just take a deep breath. The lords, the stewards, the goats with attitudes, they're all far behind you now. You're no longer standing in the manor courtyard, trying to remember if you curtsied correctly. You're not dodging wooden swords, or silently cursing the tax on bread crusts. That world is fading, gently, softly, like candle smoke curling through an open window. Feel the weight of your limbs sink into the mattress. No shackles, no shame hat. Just you, breathing slow and steady, wrapped in blankets instead of burlap obligations. You're not worried about your goat's reputation, or which way to bow, or whether someone's about to fine you for humming during lunch. Out there in the distance, the village square is quiet. The stocks are empty. The steward's scroll is blank. Even the turnips are at peace. The stars above the manor roof twinkle. silent witnesses to all those petty feuds and flower-based humiliations. But here, in this moment, there's only stillness. A hush wrapped around you like a wool cloak on a chilly evening. You did well, you know. You made it through absurd laws, ludicrous punishments, and the peculiar revenge tactics of men with too many titles and not enough hugs. Now, it's time to rest. Let your thoughts drift. Let the images soften. Let every breath carry you further from the village square and deeper into sleep. You're safe now. The feudal world has packed up its scrolls and gone home for the night. Sleep easy, friend. Sweet dreams.